She inherited a cabin in the Wasteland at 80, and her entire family laughed, calling it a curse. But what she found inside left her relatives speechless. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you're watching from. From the moment she could remember herself, the world of the girl had always been smaller than that of other children. It was not that she lacked curiosity or dreams, but because her life was bound to a narrow apartment on the edge of the city, to the slow rhythm of an aging man's breathing, to the quiet rituals of care that most people never had to learn so young. Her grandfather had taken her in when she was barely out of early childhood, after her parents had drifted away into lives that no longer had space for her. To the rest of the family, he was an inconvenient relative, a man whose stubborn independence had long ago turned into isolation. To her, he was the only person who had ever made her feel necessary. In her earliest memories, he still walked without a cane, his movements careful but steady, his eyes sharp in a way that made it feel as though he saw more than he ever said. He was not affectionate in the way people expected from an elderly guardian. He did not drown her in praise or gentle words. Instead, he taught her how to observe, how to notice when the air in a room was too dry, how to listen to the hum of an old refrigerator and hear whether it was about to fail, how to fold blankets so that heat did not escape during winter nights. It felt like ordinary domestic knowledge at the time, but even then he insisted on precision. He kept notebooks in which he recorded tiny details about the apartment, how long a kettle took to boil in different seasons, how quickly the windows fogged over when it was cold outside, how much water they consumed each week. She never questioned it. To her, it was simply part of living with him. The first signs of his illness crept in quietly. It was not a dramatic collapse or a single terrible diagnosis, but a sequence of small changes that she noticed long before anyone else did. He would stop halfway through a sentence as if searching for a word he had always known. His hands would tremble slightly when he poured tea. There were mornings when he could not straighten his back without leaning heavily on the table. She learned to adapt without being asked. She started waking earlier to prepare breakfast so he would not have to stand for too long. She organized his pills in small plastic boxes labeled with the days of the week. When he forgot appointments, she remembered them for him. The rest of the family reacted with polite distance. They called once every few weeks, asking how he was doing in voices that already assumed the answer. They promised to visit when things calmed down, when work became easier, when their own children were not so demanding. They rarely came. When they did, they stayed only long enough to convince themselves that everything was under control. They spoke about doctors and nursing homes as if they were inevitable stations on a road they would never have to walk themselves. When the girl tried to explain how quickly his condition was changing, how much effort it took to keep the apartment functioning, they nodded without really listening. As the years passed, her life narrowed further. She transferred to remote studies and eventually stopped altogether. Jobs became temporary solutions that never lasted long because she had to leave early or decline shifts whenever her grandfather had a bad day. Friends slowly drifted away, first forgiving her absences, then forgetting to invite her at all. She did not blame them. Their lives were filled with noise and motion, while hers was defined by medication schedules, doctor visits, and nights spent half awake, listening to ensure that the slow rhythm of his breathing did not falter. Despite his weakening body, there was something in him that never surrendered. On days when he felt a little stronger, he insisted on teaching her things that seemed strangely disconnected from their immediate reality. He showed her how to seal a window with nothing but plastic wrap and tape if the glass ever cracked in winter. He explained how to store dry food so that moisture could not reach it even in damp basements. Sometimes he would ask her to fetch a specific tool from a box she had never opened before, watching closely to see whether she remembered its location. It was never framed as a lesson, but she began to sense that he was preparing her for something he did not yet name. The family's impatience grew as his health declined. They began to speak more openly about what would happen when he was gone. Who would get the apartment? Who would deal with his belongings? How long the paperwork might take? Once, when they thought she was not listening, she heard them suggest that she had stayed only to secure a better inheritance. The words struck her more deeply than any argument could have. She did not confront them. She simply returned to the kitchen, where her grandfather sat with a blanket over his knees, his gaze fixed on the fading daylight outside the window. In the final months, his world shrank to the space between the bed and the small desk where he still wrote in his notebooks. His hands were no longer steady, but he continued to fill page after page with cramped handwriting. She caught glimpses of numbers, coordinates, weather patterns, and sometimes phrases that made no sense to her at all. He began to hide the notebooks when he was done, sliding them into drawers or beneath loose floorboards when he thought she was not watching. Yet, when she looked at him, he did not seem afraid. There was a quiet confidence in his movements, as though every action was part of a design only he could see. The night he died was neither dramatic nor loud. She found him in the morning, sitting upright in his bed as if he had simply forgotten to lie back down. The room was silent in a way that felt unnatural, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. For a long time, she did nothing. She sat beside him, holding his cold hand, tracing the lines of his palm that she had known since childhood. Only when the winter light crept through the curtains did she stand to make the necessary calls. The funeral was small, attended mostly by relatives who seemed more inconvenienced than saddened. They spoke about him in past tense, even while standing beside his grave, already moving on in their minds. The girl listened in silence. When it was over, she returned alone to the apartment that had been their shared universe for so many years. The rooms felt larger now, hollowed out by absence. She opened drawers she had never opened before, finding only empty spaces where his notebooks had been. Whatever he had been preparing, he had taken care to hide it well. That evening, the first official letter arrived, summoning her to the reading of his will. She sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the envelope as if it were a foreign object. For years, her life had revolved around keeping one man alive. Now, she had to learn how to exist without that purpose, and the thought frightened her more than she was willing to admit. Yet, beneath the fear, there was another sensation, quieter but persistent. A feeling that this was not an ending but the closing of one door before another opened. The letter summoning her to the reading of the will lay on the kitchen table for 2 days before she finally opened it. She kept finding excuses to postpone the moment, wiping the same already clean surface, folding and unfolding a blanket that no longer smelled of her grandfather, standing at the window and watching the city move with the indifference of something that had never belonged to her. When she finally tore the envelope, the words inside felt strangely impersonal, as if they referred to someone else's life rather than the man who had raised her. A date, an address, a formal request for her presence. Nothing more. On the morning of the meeting, she wore the same coat she had worn to the funeral, a coat that now felt heavier than before. The office of the notary was located in a restored building downtown, all polished floors and framed certificates, a place that had nothing in common with the small apartment where she had spent her life learning to survive in silence. She arrived early and waited in the corridor, listening to muffled voices behind closed doors and trying not to imagine the faces of the relatives who would soon fill the room. They came in clusters, some with forced sympathy, others already wearing expressions of calculation. Aunts and uncles she had barely seen in years greeted her with the kind of warmth reserved for strangers one must pretend to care about. No one mentioned her grandfather directly. They spoke instead about the weather, about traffic, about how complicated it was to find parking near the office. She realized that for them this meeting was not a farewell, but an opportunity. When they were finally called inside, the notary did not waste time on pleasantries. He spoke of documents, of signatures, of the importance of clarity. Then he began to read. At first, everything unfolded as the family had expected. Accounts were mentioned, modest savings divided between those who had remained officially connected to the old man. The apartment itself was left under shared ownership until further decisions could be made. The relatives exchanged glances that were not even disguised as disappointment. Then the notary paused and looked up, adjusting his glasses before continuing. The girl's name was spoken in a tone that suggested formality rather than importance. According to the will, she was to inherit a cabin located in a remote northern wasteland, an area so sparsely populated that it did not even appear on most tourist maps. The temperature in winter could reach levels that rendered the place uninhabitable by ordinary standards. The words settled into the room like a strange silence, and then someone laughed. It began quietly, a soft snort from the corner of the table, but it spread quickly, turning into a chorus of thinly veiled amusement. Comments followed, some half-whispered, others spoken aloud without shame. They spoke of punishment disguised as generosity, of a senile old man playing one last joke. They suggested that she should be grateful not to receive nothing at all. One of her uncles leaned forward and told her, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, that she would not last a week in a place like that. She listened without responding. Part of her wanted to protest, to remind them of the years she had spent caring for their father and brother while they were busy living comfortable lives elsewhere. But another part of her remained strangely calm. Her grandfather had never been a man to act randomly. If he had chosen to leave her something so specific, it could not be a mistake. The relatives did not share that thought. As soon as the meeting ended, they surrounded her in the corridor, each with a different version of the same proposal. They urged her to sell the cabin immediately, arguing that the land might still be worth something if she found the right buyer. They warned her about the dangers of the region, about wolves and frost and isolation. One aunt took her aside and spoke in a low voice, telling her that the family would contest the will if she insisted on keeping such a ridiculous inheritance. They framed their concern as kindness, but she could hear the underlying impatience in every word. She returned to the apartment feeling as though she were walking through someone else's life. The rooms still carried the memory of her grandfather, yet the future they now suggested was so far removed from this space that it felt unreal. She spent the evening searching for information about the place mentioned in the will. The internet yielded little. A handful of outdated photographs showed endless stretches of snow and a few structures barely visible against the horizon. Forums warned travelers to avoid the region in winter, citing temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in seconds. Fear began to creep in, but it was accompanied by something else: curiosity. A stubborn need to understand why her grandfather had chosen that particular place. She remembered the notebook she had never been allowed to read, the careful way he had hidden his records. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that the cabin was not a burden, but a message. Preparation became her refuge from doubt. She made lists of everything she would need, knowing full well that no list could ever be complete for a journey into such isolation. She spent the little money she had on thermal clothing, sturdy boots, a headlamp, a compact first aid kit. She gathered all the documents related to the inheritance and placed them in a waterproof folder, adding her grandfather's old notebook that she had found hidden beneath the kitchen sink after the funeral. It contained only a few pages, but they were filled with his unmistakable handwriting, sketches of unknown structures and a single sentence repeated more than once, telling her to trust the house. The night before her departure, she walked through the apartment, touching the walls, the table, the chair where he used to sit and write. She packed only what she could carry, leaving behind furniture and memories that no longer belonged to her. When she closed the door, she did not look back. For the first time since his death, she felt that she was moving towards something rather than away from everything she had lost. The journey began without ceremony, as most important things in her life had. She boarded the northbound train before dawn, carrying a backpack that felt far too light for a destination that, according to everything she had read, devoured the unprepared. The city slipped past the window in a blur of gray buildings and half-lit streets, and with every kilometer the sense of being untethered from her former life grew stronger. She had left behind the apartment where her grandfather's presence still lingered in the smallest details, the notary's office with its polished floors and dismissive laughter, and the relatives who had made it clear that her inheritance was a joke. Ahead of her lay a place that did not even feel real yet, a cabin lost somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary maps. As the hours passed, the train emptied. Families with luggage disembarked in towns that still had recognizable names. Commuters vanished first, then travelers, until only a handful of passengers remained, wrapped in coats thick enough to make movement awkward. Outside the windows, the landscape transformed slowly, like a photograph being drained of color. Forests grew denser and darker, rivers froze into pale ribbons beneath the snow, and the sky pressed lower with every mile. She kept thinking of her grandfather's notebooks, of the careful way he had recorded weather patterns as if he had known this road long before she ever would. By the time the train reached the last scheduled stop, she was alone. The station was little more than a low concrete building, half buried in snowdrifts, its single platform stretching into a void of white. A man in a heavy parka stood near the entrance, smoking in the cold, and she realized with a jolt that he must be the person she had been told to find. He did not ask her name. He simply looked at the papers she held out, nodded once, and gestured toward a battered truck idling behind the station. The ride from there felt less like travel and more like intrusion. The road was no longer paved in any meaningful sense. It appeared and disappeared beneath the wheels, sometimes visible as a darker line in the snow, sometimes vanishing altogether, forcing the driver to rely on memory and instinct. They did not speak. The engine growled through the silence, and the cold pressed against the glass with a persistence that made her grateful for every layer she wore. At a certain point, even the truck could go no farther. The driver stopped without explanation and pointed into the emptiness ahead. The cabin lay somewhere beyond that point, he indicated, too far and too dangerous for vehicles in this weather. He waited only long enough to ensure she had all her belongings before turning back, leaving her standing in a silence so complete it seemed to absorb sound itself. The first steps into the wasteland were tentative. She had walked in snow before, but this was different. Here, the cold did not simply surround her, it penetrated. Every breath felt like inhaling shards of glass. The wind erased her tracks almost as soon as she made them, as if the land refused to acknowledge her presence. She consulted the coordinates her grandfather had left, aligning them with the compass she carried, and began to move. Time lost meaning quickly. There were no landmarks, no change in scenery to mark her progress. White ground met white sky in a seamless horizon, and she began to understand how people could wander in circles here until exhaustion claimed them. When she stopped to rest, she forced herself to count breaths, to feel her fingers and toes, to ensure that sensation had not left them yet. The thought that she could turn back crossed her mind more than once, but each time it did, she pictured her grandfather's handwriting, the steady strokes that had filled his notebooks even when his hands shook. The storm rose without warning. What had been a manageable wind became a wall of force that pushed against her body and blurred the world into a moving curtain of snow. She pulled her hood tighter and bent forward, advancing in short, stubborn steps. There was a moment when she lost her orientation entirely, spinning slowly in place as panic threatened to take hold. It was only by pressing her forehead against the compass case and waiting for the trembling in her hands to subside that she found direction again. She saw the tree before she saw the cabin. It rose from the wasteland like a relic of another world, its massive trunk dark against the blinding white, and its roots disappearing beneath drifts that reached her knees. And there, half concealed among those roots, stood the structure she had come so far to find. At first, it looked impossibly small, a child's idea of a house placed in a landscape that dwarfed everything. Yet, as she approached, she noticed details that contradicted that impression. The door was shielded from the wind by a clever arrangement of timber. The walls showed no gaps where snow could intrude. The windows were narrow and angled, designed not for beauty, but for survival. Her fingers were numb when she reached the door. She expected it to resist, to creak like something abandoned, but it opened with a smoothness that startled her. Warm air spilled into her face, carrying with it the faint scent of wood and metal. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her, leaning against it as the storm continued to rage on the other side, suddenly powerless to touch her. For a long moment, she simply stood there, absorbing the impossible contrast between the deadly cold she had just escaped and the steady warmth that filled the cabin. The journey that had begun in her grandfather's apartment now found its first true pause. Whatever awaited her in this place, it was already clear that the road had not led her here by accident. The warmth inside the cabin felt unreal at first, as though it were nothing more than a trick of her exhausted body. She stood with her back pressed to the door, counting her breaths, waiting for the cold to seep through her clothes the way it always had outside. It never came. Instead, there was a quiet, even heat rising from beneath her boots, spreading upward through her legs in a slow, comforting tide. Only then did she move deeper into the room, her eyes adjusting to the soft amber light that glowed from lamps set into the walls. The interior did not resemble the makeshift shelters she had seen in photographs of remote cabins. There were no piles of firewood stacked haphazardly, no smoke stains on the ceiling, no sense of improvisation. Everything had been planned. The floor was smooth and faintly warm, not merely near the central stove, but everywhere she stepped. The walls were paneled with wood that bore no cracks, their seams so carefully sealed that not even a draft could be felt. She placed her palm against the surface and felt a gentle vibration, a barely perceptible hum that reminded her of the old refrigerator in the apartment back home, the one her grandfather had insisted on maintaining long after others would have replaced it. She found the stove at the heart of the room, but even that defied her expectations. It was not the kind of iron box she had imagined, where one shoveled in logs and prayed the heat would last the night. This one was embedded into a network of channels that vanished beneath the floor. Metal panels could be lifted to reveal insulated pipes carrying heat into every corner of the cabin. Beside it lay a set of handwritten instructions preserved in plastic, written in the same careful script she had seen in her grandfather's notebooks. They explained how to regulate the flow, how to avoid overheating the system, how to maintain it so that it could run for weeks without interruption. Her backpack slipped from her shoulders as she followed those instructions, more from instinct than from understanding. She adjusted a valve here, turned a dial there, and felt the temperature stabilize, not rising too high, not falling too low. The sensation was strangely intimate, as if she were learning the heartbeat of the house itself. She thought of all the years her grandfather had spent teaching her to listen, to notice, and she realized that he had not been preparing her to survive in the city, but here, in a place he had shaped with his own hands. Beyond the main room, she discovered a narrow corridor leading to the smaller chambers. One held a water reservoir insulated so thoroughly that the liquid inside remained unfrozen despite the conditions outside. Filters lined the wall, each labeled with dates that suggested a schedule of maintenance spanning decades. Another room contained shelves of preserved food arranged with military precision. There were jars of dried vegetables, vacuum-sealed packets of grains, tins whose contents were marked only by coded initials. Everything was accounted for. There was no sense of hoarding, only of careful calculation. She found a cabinet stocked with medical supplies that went far beyond what she had ever kept in the apartment. Bandages, antibiotics, painkillers, syringes, even equipment for treating frostbite and hypothermia. A thin notebook lay on the counter beside it, listing symptoms and responses in a clipped, professional manner. She recognized her grandfather's handwriting again, but the tone was different from the domestic notes she had seen before. This was the writing of someone who expected emergencies, who prepared for them long before they occurred. The tattered exhaustion that had clung to her since the journey finally gave way to something like disbelief. She had come expecting ruin, a shelter she might have to patch together with whatever she could find. Instead, she had entered a system, a closed loop of warmth, water, power, and preparation that felt decades ahead of its time. The cabin was not merely habitable, it was self-sufficient. She ate for the first time since leaving the last town, eating a simple meal according to instructions that ensured minimal energy loss. The food tasted better than it had any right to. When she washed her hands afterward, warm water flowed steadily from the tap, and she laughed out loud in the empty room, the sound echoing back at her in a way that felt like a response. That night, she slept in a small bedroom off the main chamber, wrapped in blankets that had been folded and stored with the same care as everything else in the house. The wind battered the walls, but the noise was muted, filtered through layers of insulation that transformed the storm into a distant murmur. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the subtle sounds of the cabin, the whisper of air through ducts, the soft clicking of metal adjusting to changes in temperature. It was the sound of a machine designed not for profit or display, but for endurance. In the morning, she woke with a clarity she had not felt since before her grandfather's death. The house did not merely shelter her, it demanded her attention. She began to explore it more thoroughly, tracing the paths of pipes and wires, lifting panels to reveal systems hidden beneath the surfaces. Each discovery deepened her sense that this place was the culmination of everything her grandfather had been working toward. The notebooks she had brought with her were suddenly insufficient. She searched the drawers and shelves, eventually finding a stack of thicker volumes concealed behind a false wall. They contained schematics, maintenance logs, even reflections written in the margins, fragments of thought that connected the technical to the personal. As she read, the story of the cabin unfolded not as a sudden project, but as a lifetime's work. There were early plans drawn in pencil, clumsy and tentative, followed by more confident revisions in ink. Dates stretched back further than she had imagined, reaching into years when she herself had still been a child. The realization struck her with a quiet force. While she had been learning to care for him, he had been building something for her. The house was not a retreat from the world, but a preparation for a future he had clearly believed was coming. By the time she closed the final notebook, the storm outside had intensified. The light filtering through the narrow windows reduced to a dim, gray glow. Yet, inside the cabin, everything functioned as if nothing had changed. She felt the heat beneath her feet, heard the steady rhythm of the systems he had left behind, and understood that this place was more than a shelter. It was a legacy, one that had waited patiently for her to arrive. The discovery of the cabin's inner systems left her restless rather than reassured. The notebooks she had read spoke in careful fragments, referring to rooms she had not yet seen, to compartments that were not marked on any visible plan. It was as if her grandfather had wanted her to understand the surface of the house before allowing her access to its deeper layers. For most of the day, she resisted the temptation to search for more, telling herself that she should first learn how to live in the cabin as it was. But every time she crossed the main room, she felt her gaze drawn to the same section of floor near the base of the great tree root that pierced the outer wall. The wood there bore a subtle difference in grain, a faint variation that would have meant nothing to anyone else. To her, it was as loud as a signpost. She knelt and brushed away a thin layer of dust, revealing the edges of a panel so precisely fitted that it was nearly invisible. Her heart began to beat faster. She remembered the final lines in one of his notebooks, the ones she had not yet allowed herself to fully absorb, telling her to trust the house and to open the lower rooms only when she felt ready. She retrieved a flashlight and a coil of rope from the supply cabinet, moving with a care that bordered on reverence. When she pressed down on the panel, it did not creak or resist. It sank slightly and slid aside with a muted hiss of released air. Beneath it, a narrow staircase descended into darkness, the steps cut into solid timber and reinforced with metal. The air that drifted up from below was cool but not cold, carrying a faint metallic scent. For a moment, she hesitated, struck by the intimacy of the act. This was no longer about survival, but about inheritance, about stepping into a world her grandfather had shaped in secret. Then, she switched on the flashlight and began her descent. The stairs led to a corridor that felt more like the interior of a bunker than the basement of a cabin. The walls were lined with sealed panels, each labeled in a code she did not immediately recognize. The first door she opened revealed a technical room filled with spare parts arranged in meticulous order. Pipes, valves, insulation sheets, electrical components, all cataloged in handwritten tags. It was the kind of stock one would expect in a professional facility, not in a remote shelter built by a man everyone else had dismissed as eccentric. The next room stole her breath. It was larger than the main living space above and entirely devoted to storage of documents. Metal cabinets lined the walls, their drawers numbered and dated. She pulled one open and found a stack of folders bound with fabric ties, each bearing stamps that had long since faded. The papers inside were not the sort of household records she had expected. They were contracts, diagrams, internal reports, all referencing facilities, contingencies, phases. Names of organizations appeared only in fragments, as if deliberately obscured, but the structure of the language was unmistakably official. She spent hours there, sitting on the cold floor and reading until her eyes burned. The picture that emerged was one of a project conceived decades earlier, a network of autonomous shelters designed to function during extreme environmental collapse. The reasons were never fully spelled out, but she saw enough to infer that the threat had been climate-driven, not sudden, but inevitable. The documents detailed prototypes built in remote regions, the successes and failures of different systems, the eventual dismantling of the program under political and economic pressure. In the margins, her grandfather's handwriting appeared more and more frequently as the years progressed, until entire pages were filled with his notes alone. From those notes, she learned that most of the shelters had been decommissioned, stripped of their equipment, or destroyed outright to prevent misuse. He wrote of arguing with committees, of watching resources diverted away from preparation and into projects with immediate profit. There was bitterness in his words, but also resolve. The final entries spoke of a decision made in solitude, of preserving one last node of the network in secrecy. In the third room, she found the financial heart of that decision. A series of safes were set into the wall, each one opened by a combination recorded in a slim leather-bound book. Inside were envelopes thick with certificates, bearer bonds, stock papers, and handwritten instructions. She did not recognize the names of many of the companies, but she could see that the values attached to them were far beyond anything she had ever imagined her grandfather possessed. Keys lay in small velvet boxes, each labeled with an address and a number that suggested private vaults rather than homes. The shock of it left her numb. She had known him as a man who repaired his own furniture, who wore the same coat year after year, who counted every coin before making a purchase. The wealth concealed in these safes did not fit that image at all. And yet the documents made it clear that none of it was accidental. He had not hoarded these assets for comfort or status. He had converted them over time into forms that could be accessed even when systems failed, that could be moved without attracting attention. The final room was smaller, more personal. Here, the shelves held photographs and letters, newspaper clippings about disasters that had faded from public memory, reports of expeditions gone wrong in polar regions. Her grandfather's handwriting filled the margins of these as well, connecting distant events into a narrative of warning and preparation. There were even notes about individuals he had tried to help, brief mentions of people he had given advice to, or resources he had diverted quietly. It was here that she found the sentence that would echo in her mind long after she left the room. Wealth without purpose is emptiness. She closed the door behind her when she finally emerged back into the main cabin, carrying nothing with her but the knowledge of what lay beneath her feet. The storm outside had not abated. The cabin hummed steadily, indifferent to the chaos beyond its walls. She stood in the center of the room, her mind racing with the implications of what she had uncovered. Her grandfather had not simply left her a refuge. He had entrusted her with the remnants of a vision the world had abandoned. Yet, even as she tried to absorb that responsibility, a new unease took hold. In one of the folders, she had read a brief note about others who might still remember the project, people who would recognize the signs of an active shelter when the crisis deepened. She thought of the tracks she had seen outside the previous evening, half erased by snow but unmistakably human in origin. The realization chilled her more than the wasteland ever could. The cabin was a sanctuary, but it was also a beacon. The unease she carried from the locked rooms did not fade when she returned to the routines of the cabin. If anything, it sharpened her awareness of every sound beyond the walls, every subtle vibration that traveled through the structure. The storm that had accompanied her arrival did not move on as storms were supposed to. It settled, deepened, and transformed into something more oppressive than weather. Temperatures dropped with a speed that defied the forecast she managed to catch through the cabin's limited receiver. What had been described as a harsh winter became, within days, a regional catastrophe. From fragments of radio transmissions, she pieced together a grim picture. Power grids in the southern towns were failing under the strain of heating systems pushed beyond their limits. Pipelines froze, burst, and leaked gas into the frozen air. Hospitals began to evacuate patients they could no longer keep warm. Roads closed not by official order, but because vehicles simply could not move. Every message ended the same way, with silence that felt longer each time it followed a voice. The first person reached the cabin at dusk on the third day of the deep freeze. She noticed movement through the narrow window, a shape that should not have existed in that whiteness. When she opened the door, a man collapsed into the entryway, his clothes stiff with ice, his hands mottled and blue. She dragged him inside with more strength than she knew she possessed, following the protocol she had studied only hours earlier in her grandfather's medical notebook. Warmth had to be returned slowly, methodically, or it would do more harm than good. She stripped away frozen layers, wrapped him in blankets stored for emergencies that were no longer theoretical, and fed him small sips of water heated just enough to restore sensation. By morning, he could sit upright, though his eyes still reflected a shock deeper than any injury. He had been driving when the engine died without warning, stranded miles from the nearest settlement. He had walked until he could no longer feel his legs, guided only by the faint hope that some structure might exist in a land that otherwise offered none. When he left later that day, armed with supplies and instructions for finding safety, she understood that this would not be an isolated incident. He was followed by others. A pair of hunters who had lost their trail and wandered for 2 days in a white blur of exhaustion. A family whose house had grown colder with every passing hour until the walls themselves seemed to exhale frost. A rescue worker whose vehicle had overturned on a buried road, leaving him to navigate the storm with a broken arm and a failing radio. Each arrival reinforced the same truth. The cabin was no longer hers alone. It had become a node in a network that no longer existed. With every person she sheltered, the routines of the house grew more complex. The careful balance of heat distribution had to be adjusted to accommodate the extra bodies. Water usage increased, forcing her to activate secondary collection systems her grandfather had described, but she had not yet tested. Food that she had imagined would last months began to disappear in days, and she learned to ration without cruelty, to give enough to restore strength, but never enough to invite waste. The storm outside did not discriminate. It erased tracks, swallowed landmarks, and made orientation a matter of instinct rather than sight. At times, the cabin felt like the only fixed point in a moving world, a tiny island of stability surrounded by an ocean intent on crushing everything it touched. When people asked her how she had found this place, she gave vague answers. She was not yet ready to explain her grandfather's legacy, and instinct told her that such knowledge, once shared, could not be contained. The complete collapse of communication came without ceremony. The radio crackled, produced a fragment of a word, then went dead in a way that felt final. She tried every frequency she had been taught to use, every emergency channel her grandfather had listed. There was no response. It was then that the full weight of her situation settled upon her. She was responsible not only for those who had already found shelter, but for anyone who might yet appear on the horizon. There would be no outside rescue. The cabin and the people within it were all that stood between life and an indifferent void. They adapted quickly, driven by necessity. The main room became a shared space where bodies slept close to conserve heat. Those with enough strength were assigned tasks without argument, collecting snow for melting, cleaning equipment, monitoring the medical station. She discovered that leadership did not announce itself in dramatic gestures, but in consistency, in the quiet certainty with which decisions were made and carried out. The others began to look to her automatically, not because she demanded it, but because the system she maintained did not fail. It was during one of these long nights, when the wind howled with such ferocity that the walls seemed to bend inward, that she noticed signs of a different kind of a presence outside. The tracks were faint, half filled by drifting snow, but their pattern was too deliberate to be the work of lost wanderers. Someone had circled the cabin, close enough to feel its warmth perhaps, then retreated into the darkness. The warning from her grandfather's archives echoed in her mind. Others would remember. She did not speak of it to the people sheltering with her. There was already enough fear without adding new shapes to it. Instead, she reinforced the routines he had outlined in his notebooks, sealing secondary entrances, checking the integrity of locks that were hidden behind panels. She discovered sensors embedded in the outer walls, primitive by modern standards but reliable, designed to alert the inhabitant to movement within a certain radius. When she activated them, a soft tone filled the cabin, almost imperceptible, but it brought with it a strange comfort. The house was not blind. As the frost deepened, so did the crisis beyond the cabin. The people who arrived spoke of towns where the lights had gone out completely, of shelters overwhelmed by numbers they had never planned to support, of authorities paralyzed by the scale of the disaster. The idea that this was an event that could be managed faded with every story. What was unfolding was not a temporary emergency, but the exposure of a fragile system pushed past its limits. Late one evening, as she reviewed the dwindling inventory with numb fingers, she realized that the cabin could not sustain this role indefinitely without access to resources beyond its walls. The supplies her grandfather had left were vast, but they were not infinite. The knowledge that had once seemed like an abstract inheritance now pressed upon her with urgent clarity. The wealth hidden in the rooms below was not a relic, it was a tool. And the frost that was breaking the world would not be defeated by warmth alone. The cabin had become a living organism, sustained by routines that no longer belonged to one person alone. Yet, even as the people inside adapted to the rhythms of survival, the boundaries of what the house could provide drew ever closer. She lay awake one night, listening to the wind assault the walls, and understood with painful clarity that warmth without replenishment was merely a delay. The documents she had found in the locked rooms were no longer abstract inheritances or distant curiosities. They were, in the strictest sense, instruments of life. She began by returning to the technical room beneath the floor, following instructions written in the careful, unassuming script she now recognized as her grandfather's final voice. Among the equipment she had not yet dared to use was a compact transmitter, its casing scratched and dented, but its internal components pristine. It had been designed for conditions precisely like these, when ordinary networks failed and communication depended on nothing but line of sight and patience. Activating it required time, trial, and a calm she was not entirely certain she possessed, but by dawn the faint pulse of a carrier signal filled the headphones she wore. At first there was only static. Then fragments of sound broke through, distorted by distance and weather, yet unmistakably human. She caught pieces of emergency broadcasts, mentions of evacuations attempted and abandoned, of resources diverted from one failing town to another in a desperate cascade. It was enough to confirm what she already knew. The crisis was not localized, it was structural, a failure of systems that had never truly prepared for this magnitude of cold. With that knowledge came resolve. She opened the first of the safes in the archive room and took out a slim envelope containing instructions that seemed, at first glance, absurdly precise. They listed steps to be followed only after certain conditions were met, protocols for accessing assets without drawing attention, even recommended language for communications that might be monitored. It was the work of someone who had never trusted stability, who had anticipated a moment when acting openly would be impossible. The first transaction she attempted felt like stepping onto thin ice. Using a sequence of numbers that functioned more like keys than codes, she established contact with an intermediary organization that still operated on legacy systems beyond the reach of most surveillance. She did not identify herself by name. She did not explain the circumstances beyond what was strictly necessary. She requested equipment, supplies, and logistical support, offering payment in forms that bypassed the channels now frozen by the storm. The response was cautious but real. Within hours, she received confirmation that her requests could be fulfilled, albeit not directly to the cabin. The last functioning transport routes ended hundreds of kilometers to the south, in a town that had become an accidental hub of displaced people and failing infrastructure. From there, delivery would depend on human endurance rather than machinery. She forwarded the coordinates of the cabin's nearest viable access points, along with compensation that ensured attention. As the days passed, she became something she had never imagined herself to be: a coordinator. The walls of the main room filled with maps, drawn not from official sources, but from the recollections of those who arrived seeking shelter. Paths that were still passable were marked in pencil, routes known to avalanche were crossed out. The cabin's table became a planning surface where the chaos outside was slowly reduced to lines and symbols. The first deliveries arrived in fragments, carried by men and women who had never been part of any formal rescue organization. They came on skis, on battered snowmobiles coaxed into life by sheer will, sometimes on foot with sleds improvised from broken doors. Fuel was the most precious cargo, followed closely by medical supplies and insulated clothing. She paid them immediately, not with promises but with transfers that they could verify on devices that still functioned when all else had failed. Word spread, though no one could say how. The cabin became known not as a secret refuge, but as a place where survival was organized, where the rules were clear and the leadership unambiguous. She established temporary shelters and abandoned structures near the southern routes, paying for generators, heaters, and volunteers willing to endure the cold to keep them running. Each new outpost reduced the pressure on the cabin itself, transforming it from a solitary haven into the heart of a growing network. It was inevitable that her relatives would hear of it. Messages began to arrive through the same channels she used to coordinate aid, their tone oscillating between outrage and forced concern. They spoke of legal rights, of misused inheritance, of decisions she had no authority to make. She read their words without responding, understanding that any engagement would only draw them closer to what she was trying to protect. The proof of her work was not in arguments, but in the living bodies that filled the shelters she funded. More troubling were the messages that carried no names at all, inquiries that asked too many questions, that referenced details from the archive she had never shared. People remembered. People searched. The faint tracks she'd seen weeks earlier multiplied, forming patterns that suggested reconnaissance rather than desperation. She tightened the cabin's security, activating systems her grandfather had clearly intended as last resorts. Panels slid into place behind walls, sealing access to the archive without visible trace. Motion sensors extended their range, mapping the frozen world beyond the tree roots in silent arcs. One night, a group approached openly, their silhouettes visible in the glare of lanterns they carried. They did not ask for shelter in the way others had. They demanded access, citing the project by a name she had seen only once in the documents below. She did not open the door. Instead, she routed power to the outer floodlights, revealing the extent of the cabin's defenses in a sudden blaze of white. They retreated after a tense standoff that left the people inside shaken but unhurt. In the quiet that followed, she walked alone through the rooms her grandfather had built, tracing the systems that had once seemed so distant from her own life. Wealth had entered her world without ceremony, but it had not brought comfort. It had brought choice. She could have used it to escape, to secure safety for herself alone. Instead, she found that she was incapable of abandoning the web of connections she had begun to weave. Each payment she authorized, each supply run she funded, was a rejection of the emptiness her grandfather had warned her about. As the frost continued its relentless grip, she prepared for what her grandfather had called the peak, the moment when the cold would reach depths that no ordinary infrastructure could withstand. She did not know when it would come, only that it would, and that when it did, the difference between life and death would not be measured in degrees, but in the quiet efficiency of the systems she now commanded. The peak did not announce itself with any new violence. There was no sudden escalation of the storm, no dramatic shift in the color of the sky. Instead, it arrived as a subtle, merciless deepening of everything that had already been broken. Temperatures sank further than any of the regional instruments had ever recorded. The cold became so absolute that metal groaned in protest and the air itself felt solid, like a barrier that resisted the lungs. The world beyond the cabin no longer moved in cycles of day and night. It existed only in gradients of gray. Reports filtered through her transmitter in fragmented bursts. Entire convoys immobilized within sight of shelter. Families trapped in vehicles whose engines had frozen mid-drive. Isolated communities whose emergency generators failed simultaneously under the strain of continuous use. It was no longer a question of whether people would die, but how many could be reached in time to prevent it. She converted the cabin fully into a coordination center. The living space was now layered with maps and handwritten logs, the walls covered in timelines of deliveries, arrivals, evacuations. She no longer slept in the bedroom, but in a chair near the transmitter, rising whenever a new signal cut through the static. The people who had gathered in the cabin were no longer merely survivors. They had become a functioning unit, trained by necessity rather than instruction, responding to her decisions with a discipline born of shared dependence. The first large-scale rescue she organized began at dawn, though dawn was only a memory by then. A line of vehicles had been spotted on an abandoned highway segment where the wind carved the snow into drifts as high as houses. The people inside had been trapped for over a day, rationing the last of their fuel in a futile attempt to stay warm. She dispatched 3 teams, each following routes mapped from the recollections of hunters and drivers who had once worked the region. They moved not as heroes, but as extensions of the cabin's will, carrying thermal packs, heated blankets, and portable beacons that pulsed with the cabin's signal. Hours passed with no word. The transmitter hissed with interference, its range degraded by the cold, until at last the first confirmation came through. The teams had reached the convoy. They were extracting people, loading them onto sleds, guiding those who could still walk. The news spread through the cabin in silence, not celebration. There was no room for relief while others remained beyond reach. The pattern repeated itself again and again over the following days. Her resources, once measured in abstract financial terms, became tangible in the form of generators installed in abandoned warehouses, fuel caches hidden along evacuation routes, temporary shelters erected in buildings long since written off as unusable. She paid without hesitation, using the legacy her grandfather had left her as a bridge between the chaos of the present and the possibility of a future. The conflict she had feared did not disappear, but it changed shape. The men who had once demanded access to the cabin returned, this time accompanied by representatives of organizations that had survived the collapse of official authority. They spoke of cooperation, of shared responsibility, of the necessity of transparency. She listened, not from behind locked doors, but in the open space of the main room, surrounded by the people whose lives depended on the systems she had activated. When they asked for control, she refused. When they offered protection in exchange for influence, she declined. Her power did not come from secrecy anymore, but from the visible evidence of what the cabin had already accomplished. Her relatives arrived at the periphery of this new order with nothing left of their former confidence. They had traveled south to escape the worst of the cold, only to find that the shelters she funded were the ones that still functioned. They tried to remind her of shared blood, of the ties they had once ignored. She greeted them with the same calm she offered everyone else, assigning them tasks, integrating them into the system rather than allowing them to stand apart from it. In doing so, she dissolved the last remnants of their claim over her inheritance. It was no longer something that could be divided. As the frost finally began to loosen its grip weeks later, the region bore little resemblance to the one she had entered at the start of her journey. Infrastructure lay in ruins, communities scattered, but the network she had built remained intact. The cabin was no longer hidden in the roots of a solitary tree. It was recognized as the nucleus of a new approach to survival, one that blended preparation with compassion, planning with trust. On a rare quiet evening, she descended once more into the archive room. The documents that had once seemed overwhelming now felt like a map she had already begun to follow. She reread her grandfather's final notes, the ones written when his hands must have ached and his breath must have come in shallow gasps. They spoke not of fear, but of faith, of his belief that someone who had learned to care without expectation would understand what to do with the power he had preserved. She returned to the main room and stood beside the stove that had welcomed her on the night of her arrival. Outside, the wind had softened, and the world beyond the windows no longer seemed intent on erasing itself. She was not the owner of a cabin in a wasteland, not the accidental beneficiary of forgotten wealth. She was the keeper of a promise that had been waiting for her all along. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Subscribe right now so you won't miss what happens next. Watch the other videos on this channel and see how ordinary lives change in the most unexpected ways. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story today.